Today I want to talk about some of the basic ideas of philosophy of religion. What would be a conception of God, a conception of the divine that has some philosophical background to it. So I don't want to make an argument from a historical tradition like Christianity or Buddhism and say because of some revelation in the past. And I don't want to make use of some of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God, like the cosmological argument or the ontological argument, which I don't think really prove anything. What I'm going to do today is talk about a possible conception of God, a possible vision, a perspective on what God might be. Of course, I can't tell you for yourself what you have to believe. So this is not about a conclusive deductive proof like a theorem in geometry or mathematics. The idea that we're not arriving at this as the result of a rational conclusion to an argument. So one way of looking at, but this is part of, I think, the basic worldview that animates some of these cosmological, teleological arguments. It's the idea that the kind of being, the kind of existence that God is or has is different than the kind of existence we have or anything else in the world has. So in the world we see things that are contingent. They could possibly not exist. You think about anything in the world. Human beings, obviously, we die, we perish. Our buildings, the things we manufacture, all pass away. We look at nature, the same thing. Plants and animals all die, pass away. And we know from astronomy that even the Earth and the Sun will pass away. And so the kind of world in which we live and have our being is a world of contingent being, of impermanent being, as the Buddhists say. So the idea is that the kind of being that God has is different than that. God has what is called necessary being, but that terminology is philosophical and means something different than necessary. But it's the idea that God does not exist in a way like us, in which God could go out of existence. And the Buddhists talk about this. One way nirvana is described, or Buddha nature is described, is as something that is unborn and undying. And I spent a lot of time trying to think, well, what do the Buddhists mean by that? That sounds sort of ghoulish or ghostly. But this idea that nirvana is unborn and undying means that nirvana is not something that comes into existence and then goes out of existence. That's not possible. So here we have this philosophical possibility, insight, idea that there are these two kinds of being. There's the fullness of being, the power of being itself, and then there's individual beings like us who could possibly not have come into existence, or could have. We can think that. We can conceptualize that. We could say, oh, the pyramids perhaps could never have been built, and that would make sense. That would make logical sense. But according to this concept of God, we really couldn't say that about God, if God is this fullness of being. We think of God as this everlasting, always existing being. And that's more definitional. That's a definition to how we might define God. God is the creator of all the particular things in the universe that come into existence and then go out of existence. But it's a philosophical way of thinking about what God is. God is that power to create, to take nothing and to create something, and only a being who has that complete, infinite ocean of being could do something like create a world. Now, some of the philosophical arguments try to prove that. They try to put that into a form that that any rational person would have to agree and say, oh, you've proved the existence of that being that gives the power of existence to other things. Thomas Aquinas, a great philosopher in the tradition of Aristotle, talked about God as being itself, esse, the very power to be. And I think this is a very powerful and interesting, somewhat mystical way of looking at God. And I think that this, if you're a theist, this is a very workable philosophical definition that just about anyone can understand. Throughout all the cultures of the world, there's always a religion, and most of them have an idea of God as this creative force that makes things. And there's more to it than that. But so it seems like that this is a basic human intuition, and the philosophers have really refined it. Now, again, this is an idea. It's a possibility. I don't think I've proven it. I don't think any of the proofs really work to prove it. And I think a lot of people study the proofs for the existence of God, and they sort of try really hard to make it work, and then other people have doubts about if it's even rational. There are arguments on both sides. So I don't think there's some absolute conclusive nature to the proofs. However, I think we sort of miss the point, because I don't think that's necessary. I think in religion, this idea of God as creator, the source of being, is a perspective. It's a way of looking at the world. You can have faith in that, more or less faith. You can absolutely believe it. You can see it. You can think that. For me personally, I don't know. I don't have absolute faith in that, but I think it's a very powerful and workable idea, and I always do think about it. I don't think it's false either. It's sort of one of these questions that is perhaps undecidable. It's sort of the mystery of existence. But just to appreciate this mystery of God as the creative source of everything versus all the impermanent things, that itself is a picture that is inherently valuable. Now, some atheists will say things like this. I don't believe in God for the same reason I don't believe in fairies in my backyard. Now, that's sort of a debate point. It's sort of funny. It seems to have a lot of, I don't know, force behind it, but it really doesn't. Nobody believes in fairies in their backyard, literally. There's no philosophers, there's no religious people saying that, except, a small minority. So people don't really believe that. And the person who said that does not have a conception of God as the fullness of being that has a necessary being, the kind of existence that can't go out of existence. That's a different idea than saying, oh, there's a fairy in my backyard. Now, some religions do have this idea of gods or spirits in nature. Japanese indigenous religion, that's a very important aspect, and they see the holiness of nature around really big trees, really old trees, waterfalls, beautiful parts of nature. They sort of feel that there's a kami-ness to it, or a god called a kami who resides there and who also is part of nature. But in any case, this atheistic idea that, oh, God is not the tribal God of various societies. Yeah, of course, people have had crazy conceptions of the divine. And even in the Old Testament, there are some aspects of the divine, of a vengeful, wrathful, jealous, tribal God. Yeah. But that's not the only conception in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There is this philosophically nuanced idea that we have this other kind of existence. And I think this is a fundamental way of really what a lot of people tend to believe, that there must be a creator of the world, that God is the maker of this world. And we see that in Genesis. There's a really beautiful metaphor in Genesis for this, that when God's creating the world, there was just sort of this emptiness and waste and this ocean of nothingness and darkness, and God said, Yehi or, let there be light. What a beautiful, powerful metaphor. I think that's one of the most powerful metaphors in all of literature. And it's very theologically astute, because God is just creating something out of this act of will, out of this, when God says a word, that you could take that as symbolic of just an act of will. So God's not using any pre-existing material, and to say this idea of light. So think of what this would mean for the writers at the time, that night is very dark, or you're in a room that's very dark, and you bring a candle and you just open it up and you can now see it and know it. It's a very powerful metaphor. And to say, well, whoa, that's like what the creation of the universe was. That is a very powerful way of looking at this. So that goes along with this philosophical idea. So we have this philosophical idea of God being a pure being that is a different kind of being than our being. And then we also have this beautiful metaphor of, well, creation is like this explosion of light in the darkness. So that's a very powerful way of looking at religion, and it's a very core idea, and I think it's very philosophically nuanced. I think a lot of the atheists and the new atheists of the 20th century, 21st century, just really ignorant of this philosophical idea that it's not just a matter of people believing the tribal God because of some scripture from thousands of years ago. There's a much more astute, intellectually respectable perspective on the world. You can think about the world this way. And this is just the beginning of what a philosophical theology would be. We haven't talked about ideas of God's goodness, benevolence, omniscience, all-knowingness, all-powerfulness. There's a lot of ways of filling this out. This idea of religious experience, what does that might teach us about philosophy? So none of that's been really talked about, but what we focused on is this idea that there are these two kinds of existences. Our impermanent existence, which Buddhists are taught in meditation, that's one of the big things, to really fully appreciate your impermanence, your mortality, and the mortality of all things, and to really meditate on that. So monks would meditate in front of corpses. They would think about their own deaths, their own impermanence, and that really, I think, provides a framework for looking at something that is not impermanent, something that's everlasting, that's doesn't come into existence or go out of existence. Nirvana is always there. God's existence is this infinite existence. And that's a very powerful philosophical way of looking at religion.